everybody, and welcome back to Seeking Play. Just a reminder that you can watch our videos on YouTube and Spotify, as throughout the series, a number of our guests built out their answers using Lego. In today's episode, we were joined by the fantastic Sarah Kuhn. Sarah is an educator, author, workshop leader, speaker, and instigator. She is also a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. Before beginning her 30-year teaching career, Sarah received her PhD in Urban Studies and Planning from MIT and a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Social Psychology from Harvard University. Sarah offers hands-on workshops, book talks, and consulting on topics related to her book, Transforming Learning Through Tangible Instruction, The Case for Thinking with Things.
Now, having watched our conversation back with Sarah, we chose three quotes that we really liked. The first one was, "We think with our hands, our bodies, and our immediate environment. That is the most powerful form of thinking." The second quote we really liked was, "Give permission to your inner voice. Schooling tends us to give a lot of outer voices." And the final quote, "As adults, we have so much cultural baggage that tells us that mind wandering is time wasting. Reframing that to give ourselves permission to see its value is wonderful." Now, we had a wonderful time talking to Sarah. We highly recommend you go buy her book, be you an educator, academic, or not. I think thinking with things is fundamental in the workplace and in the education environment. So we hope you enjoy this episode. Take care, folks.
Take care, folks. Thank you. Sarah, you are very welcome to the Seeking Play podcast. We are very excited to have you as a guest this afternoon, and we're really excited to talk all things play with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us today.
What a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for asking me. I really feel as if we have a lot in common and also some fascinating divergences that are probably more convergences, but we'll explore that. So coming from different places to the same landing point.
Cool.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, I'm actually going to start off and I am going to ask, can you take us back to your childhood, Sarah? Could you share with our listeners, what were you like as a kid?
Oh, well, one thing that really comes to mind that's relevant to this is, and I didn't have this language, none of us had this language at the time, was I was a maker. I just remember making things. I remember being in the playroom that I shared with my sister. And we had very enlightened parents, I think, because they gave us hammers and nails and pieces of wood. And I just remember building things with these materials and learning to hammer. And I had a little saw that I could saw with. But the favorite thing that gave me the most playtime and the greatest richness in my play life was a large set of wooden blocks. So I did a lot of building with blocks. I built communities, fortresses. I even, in my room, I built sort of a path with blocks because the carpet was scary and it looked like water. And I was in the San Francisco Bay Area and I would hear about shark attacks and things like that. So it's like the monster in the closet for me was a shark. So I got to walk on the blocks over the scary water in my room. So blocks were really important to me. And it's so interesting to me that after a long time away from them, I've sort of circled back to them in my life. I think that there's so much that's influential about those early experiences. I've even written an essay about the significance of blocks in my life over the course of my career, but starting with my childhood, but over the course of my career.
Is that essay complete? Can we link that in our show notes?
Totally.
Yeah, okay.
Wow.
I don't know if it's online. I'll just have to
we'll figure it out. Yeah.
Okay, I'm making myself a note.
We're giving you homework already.
That's cool. I love it. I love it.
And I
Good.
suppose while you're writing, and again, we're going to link your book, we're going to link, all the other usual stuff we'll link in the show notes. And Sarah, are there any bumps, breaks, scars, bruises, or childhood adventures that you think that are interesting, that tells a childhood story that you think contributes to your sense of identity as an adult?
Oh, what a wonderful question. So, but my schooling certainly didn't give me a lot of support for making. I remember in kindergarten, we were in one large room and there was a closed off area that had a lot of manipulatives and toys and so forth in it, but it was only for rainy days. So, and in California, we didn't get all that much rain. So and so to see those things that I wanted to touch on the other side of a barrier, and to have to sort of sit there and trace my letters and things like that, that was not good. I mean, that said, I was certainly a successful student throughout my life, and I got good grades and so forth. But some of the things that stand out to me when I think about my education, and part of why I do what I do now, is I think about the times when I was able to be a maker. In art class in 7th grade, I used driftwood to build a large sculpture that was taller than I was. And I still remember that. I can picture it in my mind. And that's when I think about teaching my college students. Part of what I think about is what will they remember? What will stay with them? And when they make and build and have visual images, I feel, and tactile memories and so forth, that feels like a very, very powerful thing.
Cool.
So, and the other thing was, I guess, I went into college wanting to study primate behavior.
Okay.
Actually, I'd had a monkey as a pet when I was in high school.
Oh my gosh.
That's one of those sort of offbeat things that people don't know about me.
Oh, wow.
But I became interested in primate behavior, and I got to college and I had no encouragement to pursue science at all. And, we're talking about 1969, 1970. And so I ended up going into philosophy and social psychology, which were also extremely interesting to me. But later in my career, I fell in with people who were working on women in science and how women are discouraged from studying science. And it took me many years to realize that, oh, that was my story too. I had sort of buried it. So, although I feel like I was generally a successful student, I think I could have been a lot more engaged. And if my teachers had understood more about how to teach, I think things would have been even more interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. It's not what you're teaching, it's how you're teaching and how you're engaging with your students, no matter what age they are, through all of the schooling system.
Well, I would say it's both. It's sort of the interaction of what you're teaching and how you're teaching. Whether you can make that fit be generative, but between the two things, the more synergy you can develop between the what and the how, the more powerful it is. But I became an academic, which means I'm one of the survivors of this school system that we have. But there are a lot of smart people who are not so successful in school and who blame themselves and are blamed. And I think that's tragic.
Agreed.
Sarah, if I was to ask you, what would adult playfulness mean to you? How would you describe adult playfulness?
I think it's experimentation and trying different things. I mean, some people, as I'm sure you know, are sort of allergic to the word play in adulthood, and they substitute other things like creativity. I'm personally a little bit allergic to the word creativity because I feel like we've made a cult of it. And innovation is not always the right thing. I think being intentional about what to bring with us from the past, including traditional and indigenous knowledge, and then thinking about where the gaps are, where innovation is needed, but not favoring it across the board as Silicon Valley tends to do. I think that's really the right balance, is taking the best of the traditional and the old and then building on that as needed. I'm wandering here. So play, creativity, innovation. I like to think about design and design thinking. And there's a wonderful phrase from Anna Crafts. I don't know if you know her work, but sadly she has passed away, but she wrote a lot about art education. And she used the phrase possibility thinking. So I think that's design, certainly. Design is possibility thinking, but play and experimentation and trying different things is also possibility thinking. When she wrote about this, one of the things she said is, when we have something, I'll take the stapler, it's just ready to hand. So when we have an object or something in our environment, we might say, what does this do, as a starting point? To learn about it and its qualities and characteristics. And then we might go on to say, what can I do with this? How can it participate in some way in my intentions? In my possibility thinking. But first we have to know it and what its affordances are, and what things we might take advantage of as we start to pursue our own intentions and ends.
And then again, I was waiting for the word affordances. That's from a Gibsonian perspective. I was like, it's gonna come. I know there's an affordance, because again, for us, it's key. Like play creates affordances and social affordances as well. And you remind me, even picking up your the stapler in the studies that are done where adults or kindergartens are asked, what would you do with a paperclip? And the affordances seen by kids is far greater than adults. So irrespective of process procedures or a paperclip, having a more playful perspective or levity, I think plays about levity and not being bound to cultural affordances. These affordances literally are there, but we fail to realize them as adults.
Absolutely. Right. And having times to experiment with things. Is really important.
And Sarah, we give all our listeners about 20 play-related quotes. You chose 3.
Okay.
Good.
Good.
I love the fact that you went for 3. Like you went, some people pick 1 or 2. You went. You're the.
Okay. Maybe like it's the most stable structure or something like that.
Yeah. So play is the highest form of research by Albert Einstein. Why did you choose that one?
Oh my. Well, I mean, in my thinking and writing about this, Einstein is a fascinating and key person. Maybe I'll hold that thought for just a moment. But I think it links to what we were just talking about with possibility thinking. And research is also about possibility thinking. You're searching, you're looking, and scientists do this, artists do this. I think, honestly, anyone who is in any way in a creative field, including business and all kinds of, medicine, I honestly, I can't think of a domain where there isn't an opportunity for some creative thinking and the benefit of that.
Yeah.
That sort of search and possibility thinking is really important.
Yeah.
So, Einstein is held up as sort of the ur-genius, the most important thinker. And I've thought a lot, and it's in my book, about the history of early childhood education, starting with Froebel in the 19th century, the inventor of kindergarten, because we didn't have kindergarten until Froebel existed, and his mentor, Pestalozzi. And then the people who came after, like Montessori and Steiner and the Waldorf schools and so forth. So Reggio Emilia, kindergarten in the preschool, whatever, early childhood education in Italy. And there's fascinating work that suggests that particularly the artists of the 20th century were greatly influenced in their mature work by their early experience in kindergarten. I think the same argument can be made for the most creative scientists of the 20th century. Like Richard Feynman is also somebody that you've referenced, and we know that his mother was trained in the Froebel kindergarten method and the materials. And I feel like I really see that in some of his mature work. Einstein, as far as I can tell, didn't go to kindergarten, but he did go to a Pestalozzi school while he was sort of waiting to be old enough and pass the exams to get into the technical school that he went to. And it had a huge impact on his life and his thinking. The freedom of that school, in contrast to the schooling that he had had up till that time, really kind of gave him permission to think in a whole new way. And I think I'm right in saying that it was actually during that time that he started visualizing himself riding on a light beam, which he has described as the basis for his epiphany about special relativity and everything beyond that. So, anyway, that's my short disquisition on Einstein, and that's part of why I picked that quote.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
So, play is our brain's favorite way of learning by Diane Ackerman.
Well, isn't that what we all want to default to? I mean, there's a reason why people's minds wander when they're sitting in lectures and sitting in boring meetings and so forth. There's, that's where we want to go. And I guess as adults, we have so many things we've learned, so much cultural baggage that tells us not to go there and that it's time wasting. And reframing that so that we give ourselves permission and understand the value of that, I think is wonderful. Again, I come back to possibility thinking, opening up to different options.
And I think even the fact that you spoke about like playing with ideas, for us, I think that seems to be the milestone or the threshold when we're talking to potential clients to say, you'll probably see kids play and they're externalizing with an object, but we ended up just becoming to a level of maturity where you're internalizing your thoughts and playing with your thoughts. And oftentimes that's where the penny drops. They go, oh, I do play with my thoughts. And we're like, yeah, so you're playing with thoughts. They're like, oh, okay, so play, it feels a bit real again. And that really for us is the one that kind of the tipping point when we reference an adult being played.
That's wonderful. And you use the expression, the penny dropping, and that's in my mind too, because especially with working with my students, I mean, my best moments in teaching are when I see the penny drop, suddenly I see and have a sort of epiphany. And I would say we think that we can do all this in our head, but the tactile element of play, I think, is really important for adults as well as for children. And we have this idea that we outgrow that, which is very wrong, I think, and is really a misreading of the work of the psychologist Piaget, who talked about stages of development that approach increasing formality and abstraction and so forth, that have led to the misunderstanding, which Piaget tried to correct late in his life, but I don't think ever, the message never quite got through, led to the misunderstanding that going from sort of what we call concrete to abstract is a developmental thing that happens naturally as we age. Instead, it's about going from novice to expert at any age. So a novice, an adult novice, would really benefit from having hands-on materials and some of the same things that we might give to, elementary school students, having visuals, having props, having that scaffolding. Just because you're an abstract thinker in some domains doesn't mean that you're across the board an abstract thinker.
Yep. So true.
That ladder to get there.
Again, the tools being, like you said, a scaffold or a ladder. I'm going to get to our final one. This is the real secret of life, to be completely engaged with what you are doing in the here and now. And instead of calling it work, realize that it is play. And that's by Alan Watts.
That's definitely a popular choice.
It's becoming a popular one.
Well, I don't think Alan Watts didn't live long enough to read about flow, but isn't that what he's talking about?
Yeah.
Really, what we now call flow. And I think I picked that because my grandmother, who lived in Manhattan, knew Alan Watts. So I just felt an intimate connection, not only to that idea, which we have much more appreciation for now, perhaps because he helped to lay the groundwork for that.
Yeah.
Also, because I have a couple of his books that were my grandmother's. So that's
wow.
Oh, wow.
Okay, cool. Attachment.
Sarah, can I ask, I'm going to bring you back to your when you were starting out your career, so your early career. So when you think back to when you were first starting out, what advice would you give your younger self about either being more serious or more playful in the way that you thought or interacted with other people?
Boy, yeah, I think give permission to your inner voice. Schooling tends, as we generally practice it, tends to give us a lot of outer voices. And I just think that I was much more, I felt that those outer voices were the legitimate voices. And that one of the things, again, that I would do with my students is to say, yes, read these things, think about them, but in the end, I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you think, because just because somebody says this doesn't mean it's right. So I think that's sort of have more, be more attuned to that and be able to listen to and take from those outer voices, but don't feel like you have to read every book that's ever written before you have permission to say something.
Okay.
No, that's very powerful. Thank you.
I'm going to jump to question 8. We can edit this bit, but Sarah, could you explain your work to a 5-year-old?
I don't need to explain it to a 5-year-old. They get it already.
They get it. Yeah.
The people.
You have a very exciting job for a 5-year-old. Definitely.
Oh my God. When my children were old enough to realize that mom was taking Lego to school with her to teach, like what? And I had to be sure not to take their Lego. So that was a problem. I was haunting the yard sales for a while so I could have my own Lego and not deprive them. A 5-year-old gets it. It's the adults who have had this sort of conditioned out of them who don't get it. But what I would say is that we think with our hands, with our bodies, and with our immediate environment.
Yeah.
And that's the most powerful form of thinking. So how can we build an education system that recognizes that, builds on top of it, takes advantage of that, takes that as the starting point for the most effective kind of learning, instead of sending people into the conventional classroom.
Yeah, and I think by way of like volume, like the education system has become a volumes game. So even for universities, colleges, any academic institution to consider how to transition to smaller spaces, more tactile spaces, if you're dealing with hundreds of students in a class. I understand tutorials are there, but that seems to be the challenge that's kind of thrown at us when we're talking about integrating the Lego Serious Play method into the classroom. Just the logistics of volumes of
yeah. But I think it's not as impossible as we think it is.
Yeah. Agreed.
It is, but it's also because most of us, you folks are an exception, most of us are not even trying it on a small local scale. I think if you have a seminar or a small class where you experiment with this, you begin to see that it might be possible to do in a different way on a larger scale. And when I teach faculty, gosh, I guess the biggest group I've taught was probably 55. And, there are things you can't do with that larger group, but you can definitely have people build things. It just, when they talk about what they've built, they might talk with the 7 other people at their table rather than present to the whole group. But there are definitely ways to do this. And I think students should buy a box of Lego at the college bookstore at the start of their freshman year and just carry it with them through the whole 4 years, and that every instructor should make some use of it in some way. I think it's
I also think, Sarah, that, COVID has shown us all how adaptable we are to change, especially the education system. I mean, people had matters of 24, 48 hours taking everything online. So I do think anything is possible in the classroom, whether it be incremental changes or, redesigning the physical space of the classroom. I do think COVID, the lesson and the beauty of COVID has taught us that we can make changes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was so much pain there for educators and for learners. But the people who inspired me the most were the people who taught studio art. And you think, man, how can you do this? But they made packets of materials and mailed them to their students. They had their students, look around in the space where they were and just pick things. And, there's something quite powerful, actually, about taking things that are ready to hand. And, talk about possibility thinking.
Yeah.
How am I going to teach my students, natural dyeing when they don't have white fabric and they don't have the dyes that I prepared for them? Well, it turns out that certain things from the grocery store can be used. And, you don't want to send people to the grocery store unnecessarily in the middle of a raging pandemic, but there were ways around that. And I was just fascinated by how they figured it out. And you really can do it. And everybody learned to use Zoom, which means you can show what you made. So although, teaching virtually is not my favorite way, it certainly can be done, and it opens up a lot of new possibilities also of international collaboration and cross-cultural dialogue and so forth.
So Sarah, before I'm going to ask, you're going to share some slides with our listeners about your research. I would just love to ask you beforehand,
Could you talk to me a small bit about how did your career evolve over time before we get you to present your work?
Sure, absolutely. One thing I don't mention very often because it's just very confusing to people. There's a lot that's confusing about my career to people, and sometimes even to me. It was very much a jagged path, but one with some continuity that feels good. So my graduate degree is in urban studies and planning, but I was not trained in design. I was trained in sort of social and economic policy, so which has design aspects to it. They're just not physical design. And then I got an academic job teaching in a department of policy and planning at a state university. And how to summarize this?
Take your time. I want to hear the jagged edges.
I think I don't even remember all the jagged edges. But yeah, I was interested in the workplace and how work takes place. I was particularly interested in people in computer programming and how their work was changing. That's what I wrote my dissertation on. So I did some early research on that workforce in Massachusetts. I had actually learned about computers a little bit while I was still in high school, which is quite unusual for girls, especially of my generation. This was like long before even the mini computer. The computers that existed filled a room, basically. So computing was not something that was totally alien to me, and I was interested in that workforce. But I grew, because I was teaching, I grew more and more interested in teaching and learning, which was something that had never been a part of my education, even as a graduate student. I was never taught to teach. And in fact, because I was in elite institutions, I had a lot of what I would now call bad pedagogy, people who lectured or things like that. Yeah. And it worked because the students were so smart. And they were able to bridge the gap and get something from these sort of lecture sessions and so forth. But I started to learn thanks to a faculty teaching center that my university created that was precisely for faculty development and introducing faculty to questions of, well, what do we know about how students learn in college? I was able to learn some things about teaching and learning, and I just got more and more interested in that. I feel like I'm leaving out some big things, but anyway, so that's where thinking with things in the classroom came in. I was teaching about sort of the social dimensions of computing. I was teaching an undergraduate sustainable development course, which I really didn't know much about, but neither did anybody else at the university. We're talking about like the mid-1990s. So because nobody else was doing it, by that time I was in the Department of Regional Economic and Social Development. And we said, we don't have an undergraduate major, but we need to do something for undergraduates. How about sustainable development? So another colleague and I developed a class, and that was fascinating. And we saw the students, talk about the penny dropping. It was really fascinating. But over time, teaching that course and then its successor course, which I called Designing the Future World, I introduced more and more hands-on work and then hands-on projects that began at the middle of the semester and went to the end of the semester, culminating in an open house where students showed their work to visitors.
So if you could give a timeline in terms of your book being published, because we're going to transition to your wonderful book, all that tinkering and learning and, failing and learning and forwards and backwards, How long was that journey between really integrating, thinking with things into the classroom to the culmination of your book, it being published?
Oh man. Well, in a way, it was a lifetime of being a maker, starting with those blocks in my playroom at home. And then continuing as I had time, making on the side, but for a long time, I didn't have much time for that. But I think in a way, it sort of burst back into my teaching. It would not be denied forever. I jumped back in. And people ask me sometimes, well, how long did it take you to write this book? And I don't know how to answer that because I feel like I was incubating it for a long time. I taught for 30 years at the university. And so it was a gradual development of this pedagogy. And I had already brought Lego into the classroom before I encountered Lego Serious Play and Robert Rasmussen. But that was critical also to sort of reinforcing the fact that I was on a really interesting and good path. So it had been gestating, but maybe it was a decade between the time that I thought, oh, this needs to be a book, and the time that I finished it.
Overnight success.
Yeah.
Just
oh man, no, I'm just slow. But it's partly some people are able to continue to make progress on their writing while they're also teaching and serving on committees and so forth. I tried and tried, and I never was able to make that work for myself. So I had to kind of grab the summers and the winter break and so forth and do as I can. But essentially, this was the book that I wanted to read, except nobody had written it. And now all of a sudden, it's very exciting because several books have come out very recently, around the time that mine came out or a little after, in which people are exploring so-called embodied cognition and thinking with your body and how we should teach.
We actually had a guest on our show, Susan Harak. She was the author of Minding Bodies. She recommended your work to me. So that's actually where I found you. So shout out to Susan.
Oh, shout out to Susan. And I just met Susan at a conference. Yes.
Yes, and she had contacted me.
Less than a year ago. Yes, yes. And thank you, Susan.
And she's doing great
wonderful
work as well in the classroom. So yes, it's fantastic to see there's a movement.
I want you to tell us about your book. So
yes,
we loved it. It goes without saying.
I'm glad. I'm so
glad.
Link
to the show notes.
Transforming learning through tangible instruction, the case for thinking with things. So we'll link everything for our listeners in our show notes.
Highly advised. Anyone in academia, anyone in learning environment, you need to buy the book. So you have control. You are now sharing the screen.
Great. Okay. So I think anyone who has been to college, maybe even high school, will recognize this room. And this is the room that I mostly taught in over my 30-year career. And I really came to understand what a barrier it was to really authentic, effective learning. I mean, it was something that I kind of took for granted as the standard way things went. So I didn't initially question it. It was what I had experienced. It was the way everything was set up. And so I just went with it. But as I learned more about what is effective college teaching, and also as I watched my students respond to things, be turned off or bored by other things, I really came to understand that this was not only a suboptimal setup, but I came to call it the sensory deprivation chamber. And one of my epiphanies along the way came when I had very young children at home. So I was a mother of young children. I was a full-time or more than full-time professor. I was a wife. I commuted 2 hours a day to my university. I mean, it was overwhelming. But this was in the days before we had like websites, or what they're called now, learning management systems for classroom, where you could post the readings before the class even started, and students would be able to access them themselves. I was teaching a course called Sustainable Development, and it didn't have a textbook. I don't think there were any textbooks at that time for that subject. So I was handing out photocopied readings every week for students to read for the next class. And that morning I pulled into the parking lot, and suddenly I realized I had forgotten to hand out the reading for that week. And I thought, oh my gosh, what will I do? I didn't have a lecture prepared because I hate lecturing. I really like to have a conversation with my students. I like to explore the reading that we've done, but you can't do that if you know the students haven't done the reading. So how am I going to fill this hour and 15 minutes? But I had a tub of Lego in the back of my car, as parents often do. And I thought, well, I thought about bringing this into the classroom. I guess now is my chance. And so I lugged it upstairs to my classroom. And my students had already watched a film about suburban sprawl, and they had read a reading about the built environment and sustainability. So they had some background in this. And I gathered them around a table, put out the tub of Lego, and I said, I'd like each of you to take 5 minutes to sketch out a small sustainable community. And you do not have time to put the bricks together to build buildings. Just, put them down and say, okay, this is the library, or these are the houses, whatever, whatever you say it is what it is. Do what you can in 5 minutes. And they were chatting happily as they picked out pieces of Lego and put them down and built out their communities. Then we went around the table and each student described what they had built. And then it came back to me, and I was so excited by their level of engagement and the fact that even students who really didn't want to speak in class had spoken because they had something to speak about. They could point to things. And Jane and Ronan, I'm sure you see this in your consulting work all the time. It's one of the really powerful things about Lego and other physical materials. So I was thrilled by their engagement and their participation, and I was really dismayed that they had not absorbed any of the lessons about sustainable building that I had been trying to teach them, because they did the very conventional stuff, very automobile oriented, no public transportation, no nothing. So I gave them feedback, of course, in a nice way. And I said, I noted the things that I thought they might want to add. And I said, well, now try adding to what you have here. You can connect your communities, you can alter them. How would you supplement what you already have? How would you alter what it is in order to make this more sustainable? So they did that. And then we repeated the same process and discussed it again. But sort of that was my first experience of Lego in the classroom. And it was very, very powerful for me, both as a way of engaging students and getting them to try to act on their knowledge, think about what the implications for action are for the things that they've heard, but also for me to be able to see what they know and what they don't know as a way of further, helping them to the next level. So why was this so powerful? it was really a puzzle. I mean, I felt it in my bones, but I couldn't explain it to anybody else. And then I discovered what scholars call embodied cognition and the sort of neuroscientific basis for it. And I discovered this very ugly little creature who is actually a diagram. He's a diagram of how much of each part of the body is mapped onto the sensory cortex of the human brain. So you can see the hands are enormous. I would say they're maybe at least half of the sensory cortex. People ask why the eyes aren't larger, because of course we're very visual people, but there's a whole other visual cortex for that. So this is just the sensory, and the motor part of the brain is also, the motor cortex generates a very similar diagram. But this tells me something about how powerful the hands are. And, you know, what do we give those amazing hands to do in the classroom? We tell them to sit still and take notes and don't fidget, right? Don't fidget. How many people have been told that? And don't doodle and don't knit because you're just distracting yourself. Well, no.
Quite the opposite.
So one of my favorite things to ask people, strangers, actually, now I've sort of given away the punchline, so I won't ask you, Ronan and Jane, although you can volunteer this, but I love to ask people, you know, when and where do you get your best ideas? And on very rare occasions, there's someone who says, you know, when I'm at my computer or when I'm at my desk, but that's very infrequent. The shower is a very favorite answer. And that's what leads to this cartoon, which I adore. But other people say, you know, when I'm going for a run, when I'm falling asleep, or when I'm waking up, when I'm sitting out in the yard under a tree, when we're in our bodies and when we're in nature, we really, I think, often get our best ideas. Of course, you know, our conscious intellectual mind is functioning, but other parts of our mind are engaged as well. So I talked earlier about how important blocks were to me, but they're also important in the history of science. And this is one of my pieces of evidence of that. The young man on the right is J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant physicist who came to be known also as the father of the atomic bomb, which is a very mixed legacy, of course, but a brilliant man who did a lot of things in physics. And when he listed his favorite things as a boy, one of them was building with blocks. Another was studying rocks and minerals. And there's a great, the Oppenheimers were a German Jewish family, and in fact went to visit relatives occasionally back in Germany. His uncle in Germany gave him a set of rocks and minerals, which were very precious to him. Just as an aside, the other boy is Robert's younger brother, Frank, who I find the far more interesting of the two. He was the founder, the mind behind and the creator force behind the Exploratorium Science Museum in San Francisco, which is a world famous science museum with full of hands-on exhibits.
Yes.
You know it, Ronan? Have
Absolutely. Yeah. With some, we aspire to bring our kids there.
Good. Well, think of Frank Oppenheimer when you do.
Yeah.
He also was a physicist. He had to leave college teaching because he was blacklisted during the McCarthy era. I think he was never a card-carrying communist, but his wife was. And he gradually worked his way back into academia. And at the University of Colorado,
Mhm.
He had what he called a library of experiments, rolling carts that students could borrow that had physics experiments sort of bolted to the top. So students could actually play with things,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
learn physics in a hands-on way.
Wow.
So yeah, he really understood that. And then of course, mature scientists, this is Watson and Crick, who are credited with discovering the structure of DNA,
Yeah.
and who famously built this model that was one part of their investigations. It's a complicated story for which I do not have all the details, and people debate to this day who should get how much credit.
Right.
But I think the fact that these two incredibly knowledgeable scientists nevertheless felt that it was important for them as part of their work to build something physical, says a lot to me.
Mm.
And then, so the blocks that the Oppenheimers had, that Buckminster Fuller had, and that Frank Lloyd Wright had, were Froebel blocks, the German educator. This is from a manual for Froebel teachers. And Frank Lloyd Wright's mother was trained as a Froebel teacher. And of course, he had the materials at home. And as a mature man, he wrote about these blocks and how important they were to him. He said, "They are in my fingers to this day." Well, doesn't this look like a Frank Lloyd Wright house? I think these early childhood influences show up in mature work in ways that we often don't even inquire about, because it doesn't occur to us that might even be possible.
Yeah.
Well, so I think you can see what happens to students when you bring Lego into the classroom. And this, has been a joy for me. I hated lecturing. I did very little of it, as little as I could get away with, and less over the course of my career as I learned how to do things differently. But it livens up any group when you bring Lego into the meeting room or the classroom. Here's a particularly memorable moment for me. I gave my students this challenge fairly often about, one thing that you'd most like to have in your personal learning environment. And this is a replica of something that one of my students built. He was in nuclear engineering, and he sat in my class and he never spoke. He just sat there. He did come to class, but I just couldn't get inside his head. I didn't know what was going on. And it was really a mystery to me. And then I did this exercise, and this is what he built. And he said, "This is reflection. I need reflection." He said, "I come to class and I'm just taking it all in, kind of as if I'm a tape recorder. And I'm a commuter student, so I have a fairly long drive home. I get in my car and I just play everything back, and that's when I learn it." And I thought, oh my goodness, he really is here. He's paying attention. And I never would have known this if we hadn't done this exercise.
Wow, how insightful.
Yeah, it was amazing. So you don't have to use Lego. There are lots of different things around. And this is a concept map that a colleague and I made because we wrote a paper about thinking with things and teaching with things. And we had 3 case studies, one of which was our own collaboration and using a Tinker Toy concept map for collaboration. And you can draw concept maps on the whiteboard, you can draw them on the computer, but what's lovely about this is how reconfigurable it is. And you can have a group of people standing around a table writing things on Post-its and putting them on nodes, saying, well, what if we did this? What if we did that? And again, coming back to design thinking and possibility thinking, I think the affordances of Tinker Toy concept maps support certain kinds of experimentation in exciting ways.
Mm-hmm.
So to get back to education, and also about possibility thinking and reconfiguring things, I am not a chemist. I could hardly tell you the first thing about the periodic table, actually. I know I learned about it once, but I've forgotten everything. But what was a revelation to me was finding a whole book from the mid-20th century that was like 100 different ways to represent the periodic table. I thought, wait, what a minute, isn't there just one way? Because there's one canonical way that we're all taught, and it's been revised a little bit over time. But on the right-hand side, the image on the right is an image from that book. And again, representing phenomena in different ways brings out different characteristics of the phenomenon. So a periodic table made with Lego is one thing. A periodic table made with Post-its is another. And I think asking students to find a different way of representation is really, really interesting and important. My music education colleagues have their students abandon standard European notation and develop a new notation system. And this gets them into, outside the box, as we might say. So, but to be able to think with things in the classroom was very difficult when I was schlepping materials around all the time. So finally I had a sympathetic provost, and he let me create a room that really would support hands-on working. Initially I called it the Laboratory for Interdisciplinary Design, because I was in a technically oriented school, but then I started calling it the studio classroom. But the point was it supported having physical materials and storing student work in progress and so forth. One thing that I didn't anticipate as I was exploring thinking with things is the benefit of manual activity that is very low cognitive load in helping people to pay attention. So I'm personally not a doodler, but I know that there are people who are doodlers, and I also know that they get shamed for doodling. But doodlers know that the right kind of doodling can really enable you to pay attention in a situation where, maybe something is a little bit boring, or, in a lecture or something where your mind tends to wander, that some very low cognitive load manual activity can reduce mind wandering. So this is my little proposition here. I call it the boring lectures survival kit. The standard fidget spinner. It's not my favorite thing, but is certainly deserves to be here. Is one thing, but a knitting spool, knot tying, sort of fidget toy in the lower left, a stress ball, and also this sort of follow the line Japanese embroidery, where there's a pattern printed on the cloth, and you just keep stitching and stitching. I think all of these things are opportunities for low cognitive load, manual engagement. Again, an excited student with a project, because I started introducing projects into my sustainable development class and then into my designing the future world class. And this is my last slide.
And I'm just going to recommend the book once more. Like it is a very good book. It's important. So thank you for sharing that. And all this talk of tinkering,
Yes.
it kind of gives us a lovely segue into, we did ask you to do some tinkering for us. We posted you a little, what we describe as our play pack, and you very kindly got on board with the idea.
Well, thank you. I've been drinking the Kool-Aid for so long
Yes.
that it actually, when my first thought was, oh, I don't really want to do this. Been there, done that, got the T-shirt. But
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you encouraged me to do it because it was fun. I have it right here.
Yes. Okay.
I don't know quite what I'm going to say about this, but I think that will be fun to improvise here.
Well, I've got build number 1. If you can,
Yes.
So what inspires you about your work? What keeps you curious and motivated?
What's exciting to me is partly, I think what gets exciting for students also is that you get to draw on parts of yourself that you've been told are not part of success in an academic career and are not part of research and scholarship and so forth. And there's so much joy and pleasure to be had in thinking with things and moving your body and manipulating things with your hands. I mean, that is how we evolved to learn, by exploring the world, using our hands and all of our senses to explore the world. So, I had used this, I built with very bright colors to indicate that it was exciting and stimulating. And of course, nature comes in here as well. And I feel as if I'm standing there with the net trying to capture things.
Lovely.
And it's fun, but it's a huge world. It's sort of related to everything in the universe. So how to make it bite-sized in a way to convey it to myself and to people is challenging. But the crab is there because for lateral thinking. Crabs move sideways, and I think digging a deep hole in one spot has a lot of value, but moving sideways, which is always my impulse, and bringing disciplines together, bringing together things that people think are totally unrelated to one another, like crocheting hyperbolic planes, which I would love to get to after we finish the 1, 2, 3. So remind me to come back to that if you don't mind.
Okay, so build number 2, how do you think your work helps people think and feel differently about the world?
So here is build number 2 with the plant and the dark colors moving up to light colors, and then two animals. But the person is to this sort of robotic person who's looks like he was built in a box. And we put people in a box, and we tell them that the information of their senses and their bodies is irrelevant to intellectual activity, when nothing could be further from the truth. So letting people out of that box, I think, is really important, and helping them to get back into their experiences, all those experiences that they were having in childhood that got trained out of them.
That's very good.
Beautiful.
Creating a permission, environment of permission to experience those things.
Final build. What curiosity or conundrum do you want to conceptualize with Lego? We just described that as our free play section.
Oh, okay. Well, you had a separate prompt that was about research, and that's very much on my mind right now.
Yes.
And so that's the third thing here.
Hey.
So here's the researcher, but sort of standing behind a barrier in which she can see to the other side, where there's a treasure chest filled with knowledge and a fish from the natural world. But but she can't access it directly. She has to use her fishing rod to get to that knowledge. And I have a two-pronged agenda going forward. One is to contribute to research that would build an evidence base for the kind of thinking that I and others have been doing. You mentioned Susan Rock, and there are a number of other people. There's, at this point, quite a decent track record of scholarship on embodied thinking, but just sort of as basic science and people who want to understand cognition. And that's very useful, but it's a long way from there to how would we teach differently, which is the question that really motivates me. And doing research on what works in the classroom is very challenging because there are so many variables in the classroom. But it certainly is doable, and people have done it. They just haven't really done it about this particular topic. You can also psychologists can do laboratory research on this, and there's an opportunity for that as well. So I'm trying to pursue with a collaborator both of those prongs. And by the way, I'm very interested in collaborating with other people who, have the interest, skills, and knowledge to do this kind of work, because I think the more people we have working on this, the better. My favorite example, sort of, or counter example or something, is I became a knitter. I learned to knit a little bit as a child, but I didn't pursue it. I became a knitter, I don't know, 15 years ago because of the crocheted hyperbolic plane. And I discovered that knitting, like doodling, is one of those things that can be keep the mind from wandering. And I started looking for research on this, and there was zero research on knitting. I had a colleague at that time who had all of the right, she was a PhD psychologist, she had all the right skills, she studied the science of learning, and she was an avid knitter. And I tried to persuade her to study knitting because there was nothing. And the knitting, all knitters know this. So there are, I venture to say, 1 million people or millions of people around the world who know this, but it has never been documented in a rigorous academic way. And she said, no, I can't do that. It was, it's stigmatized. And she didn't want to be stigmatized, and her advisors had advised her against it. She didn't even knit in meetings because she didn't want to be stigmatized. She didn't have tenure yet. And I get it. I totally get all that. But I think that's been a huge barrier to studying this sort of stuff, because the people who sit on committees that decide who gets funding from the National Science Foundation are almost never knitters. And they don't get it. And you need a critical mass of people on those panels to get funding for something like that.
Just even something you mentioned about like not having tenure yet, and the way many academic institutions are, people are doing short-term contracts. So even tenure, as I understand it, is a kind of a vestige of a previous way of employability. So therefore, your ability to actually take risk, like everything you were talking about and advocating in your book, and everything we're advocating ourselves to try and bring it into every level of academia, from kids to mid-school to it just
You're more
feels like
risk-averse,
the risk adversity is increased, yet our need for innovation and pedagogy is as great as it's ever been.
Absolutely. And I mean, I spent 30 years in academia, but part of the reason why I left was I had come to feel as if I was working on an assembly line.
Mm.
And that was, in spite of the things I was able to do in the classroom, sort of churning out grades, and students' increased focus on grades, which I thought was very unfortunate. And the sort of anxiety that students understandably have about their futures and their lives in this world where there's very little security. Yeah, and that extends, as you rightly point out, to academia. I mean, one of the great strengths of the tenure system is that once you have tenure, you can start taking risks.
Yes.
And at least up to a point, you still have to be sort of accepted by your peers in your field, and have your conference papers accepted and things like that.
So I think that's everything. I mean, it's been a wonderful conversation.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Well, let me tell you about crocheted hyperbolic planes.
Yes.
Yes.
Let's do that.
I had a year's sabbatical at a small experimental engineering school in Massachusetts. As a thank you to them for hosting me for a year, I said I would teach one of their so-called co-curriculars. These are non-credit things that might meet once a week for a period of time around a certain topic. And I had gotten interested in textiles. I was very interested in how textiles and non-rigid materials might play a role in engineering. So I thought this is the perfect time for me to experiment with this. So I said, I'd like to teach a co-curricular called Sewing for Engineers.
Nice.
And I got it was wildly popular with students, which was fascinating. And they gave me a little budget, so I bought some materials, but I also bought a few books for the library to leave behind. And one of them was called Crocheting Adventures with Hyperbolic Planes. And for those who don't know what a hyperbolic plane is, which is almost everybody, it's a different kind of plane. In school, we learn what's called Euclidean geometry, where a plane is a flat surface that continues forever and parallel lines stay equidistant. They never meet, but they never diverge. But there's also a field, domains of geometry called non-Euclidean geometry. And the hyperbolic plane is from non-Euclidean geometry, and it is not flat. So parallel lines, for example, behave differently on a non-flat plane. And this is the point where people glaze over. So I have my prop here. So this is a crocheted hyperbolic plane.
Ah.
Wow.
And what it is, the formal definition in mathematics is a surface of constant negative curvature. Now, what is that? I know that doesn't explain anything, does it? So a beach ball is a surface of constant positive curvature. So that's kind of simple. A banana has positive curvature and negative curvature. This is what I have come to understand. But if you're having trouble with this concept, so did mathematicians until the mid-19th century. They thought that a surface of constant negative curvature was an impossible object until an Italian mathematician finally made a paper model of one and showed that, in fact, it was a thing. And then in the 20th century, some American mathematicians got very interested in this. And one of them married a theoretical computer scientist from Latvia named Daina Taimina. And she moved to the US and was hanging out with these guys who were making paper hyperbolic planes, but they were sort of falling apart because they were paper and Scotch tape, and taking them to a conference was, you had to sort of crush it down into your suitcase. She said, well, I think that I could crochet one of these. And she did. And of course, the mathematicians were happy too, because they were a lot more packable and more durable. But then a whole community of people who didn't give two figs about mathematics said, oh, that's an amazing object. That's incredible. I want to make one of those. And then there were people who were interested in mathematics and were interested in the arts and fiber arts. And one of the things that they created was a crowdsourced international art project called the Crocheted coral reef. Because when people look at this form, they see many things, but one of them that a lot of people see is coral, or kale or lettuce. I've had people look at this and say, oh, it looks like the structure of the universe. And I think that is fascinating. That's where I want to pursue that. So it's been a wonderful thing to think with for me, because first of all, the idea that the Venn diagram of crochet, which we think of as, little old ladies, grandmothers, their province on the one hand, and graduate level mathematics on the other hand, I did not think that there was an overlap in that Venn diagram. And the fact that there was amazing. And it actually led me to do a project at my university in which I brought together a team of people from a lot of different disciplines to say, how might we use the fiber arts to teach science, technology, engineering, and math concepts?
Yeah.
And we had a whole list of opportunities. We didn't have time to develop them into curriculum, but that work is there to be done. And I'm excited about the possibility that maybe people will want to do that.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
I want one of those. It feels tactile. My hands are drawn towards the screen. I just want to have it and play with it.
Isn't that amazing? I will send you one. Send me a snail mail address. And I will send it.
I'd like to thank you so much. You've been a wonderful, wonderful guest. You've been a great sport. And yes, I'm so thankful that we got to, have this great conversation with you today. And I know that I have learned so much, and you have definitely brought a lot of insights this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
It's been a huge pleasure. And the conversations like this just, feed my heart and give me more energy to continue doing this work. And I'm just so eager to meet more and more like-minded people who would like to pursue this in some way. So I really want to encourage people not to be shy, and please to reach out to me. I love hearing from people at any kind of level of involvement, anything that people want to do. And if you're part of a school, I do professional development workshops for faculty, and including high school teachers, but also I do community workshops along these lines and give presentations and so on. So I'd love to.
Well, we're going to link everything in our show notes, so all of our listeners will have all of that information.
Absolutely. Hire Sarah Kuhn. She's amazing.
And read the book.
And
buy the book. Thank you so much, Sarah.
It's been a pleasure, Sarah.
Thank you. I really appreciate your invitation and your time.